So thank you very much for being here for this review of the chapters that we've covered so far in the Lamrim related to insight. And I wanted to just give kind of a high-level overview of the topics that we've been covering, in particular the sections that Geshe Darge has been covering, which is these are chapters 22 and 23. But I wanted to start out with just a really quick run through of the chapters that we've already covered and the subjects that we've already covered, because I'm a slow learner. And, here we are jumping into the very detailed topics in chapters 22 and 23. And if you can't remember the preceding, where are we? Is kind of where I started with when I sat down to try to do this review. So, chapter Lamrim Insight Review. Okay, so this would be, I think that didn't reduce the font.
No, this is like how.
Oh, it shows up like that?
Yeah,
Huh. Oh, weird.
Oh,
weird. Oh, there you go. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Yeah, the first 4 points. Okay. So the topic is how to train an insight. And to give the quick overview here, the topic that we're looking at is fulfilling the prerequisites for insight. That's chapters 8 to 24, right? So remember, we're only on 22 and 23. So this is just the prerequisites for, cultivating insight, for understanding insight. And then chapters 25 and 26 are the classifications, how to actually cultivate insight in meditation, right? So how are we really going to sit down and meditate on this topic? And then how do we know, that whether or not we've really achieved our understanding of emptiness, of insight. So it's not until chapter 26. Okay, so here we are, we're still in the prerequisites. In chapter 8, we talked about, this is the next slide, relying on definitive sources. We talked about the difference between provisional and definitive meaning. And then going back up to chapters 9 to 24. So that's a little bit further down. The stages of entry into reality, meaning how to determine the philosophical view of emptiness. So with chapter 9, we looked at the stages of entry into reality, meaning how to enter into reality to attain nirvana. And then chapters 10 to 24 then are the actual determination of reality. So we talked about and it's amazing how much we've already covered. Chapters 10 to 17, which we did with Geshe Ngawang Kelsang, was identifying the object to be negated by reason. Chapter 10, so that's the overall topic, right? Identifying the object to be negated. And the reason I think it's worth going through these topic headings is, as we then delve into chapters 22 and 23, if there's terminology that doesn't make sense or a concept, such as what is the object to be negated, right? that, you can't remember, then you see from this little outline, where to go back and pick up those concepts so that, because like we said, this is the prerequisites for understanding emptiness. So chapter 10, specifically is misidentifying the object to be negated. And that's when you have an overly broad identification of the object to be negated. Chapter 11 is how does this relate to the very important topic of dependent arising and emptiness. Chapters 12 to 15, if you remember those, those were hard. That was rational analysis, showing that the Madhyamika critique does not eradicate conventional existence. So that's really, really important. And that comes up, again and again, making sure that we still have, that's underlying understanding of conventional existence, and we're not, going too far and thinking that nothing exists, right? Then chapter 16 would be the second point is, so if the first one was refuting too much, then the second problem would be not negating enough, right? So refuting an overly restricted identification of the object of negation, so not negating enough. So ending up with just a little bit, you're holding on to something that identifies some identifying characteristics, that allows you to just differentiate one object from another. And then chapter 17 was the actual object of negation. So really, after coming through all of those filters, so to speak, what is the actual object of negation in the through the understanding of the Prasangika Madhyamikas. Okay. So then, having gone through that, right, we've got a better sense of what's the object to be negated. Then 18 to 21, those were hard chapters too. That was whether to carry out the refutation with a Svatantrika procedure or a Prasangika procedure. And Geshe Ngawang Kelsang walked us through the different logical means of logical analysis and the differences in tenets between the Svatantrikas and the Prasangikas. So you can go back and take a look at that. Now here we are with chapters 22 to 24. This is where we are now. How to use that procedure, the Prasangika procedure, to generate the right philosophical view. Okay. So the top subtopics are how to determine that there is no self in the person, and actually determining that the self lacks intrinsic existence. So that brings us down to chapter 22, which we just finished, which was analyzing a chariot as the example. And the same logic that was explained in chapter 22 is then carried over to chapter 23, which we've just started, which is the person lacks intrinsic existence. So we were going to apply that same 7-point analysis that we went through in chapter 22, using that same structure and applying it now to the different object, meaning the person. Okay. And then looking ahead, chapter 24 then follows up with taking this, a step further. The object under discussion is no longer the person, but it's the selflessness of phenomena. Okay, so that's going to be really interesting too. And then it goes on from there. With chapter 25 being different, insight requires analysis, classifications of insight. Chapter 26, which is how do you bring the whole of volume 3 together, right? Because the first part was, shamatha, meditative serenity, and now we're talking about insight. So chapter 26, I guess, puts those together. So that'll be great too. So where are we now? So we are deep in the weeds in terms of the analysis of determining that there is no self in the person. So this section has 3 parts, and we're still on the first part, which is actually determining that the self lacks intrinsic existence. Giving the example of the lack of intrinsic existence and showing what it illustrates, connecting the example to the meaning. So more specifically, if you look at the subpoints in this section, so we're showing that the chariot exists imputedly without intrinsic existence, right? So we're going to go back to our old friend, the chariot. And then the next section was eliminating objections. And then next was how to establish the chariot under various names. And the fourth point was the advantage that you find in view quickly by using this example. So since this is just a quick review class, I only have time to really cover this first point. So we're just going to focus on, we're not going to be able to cover the last 3, but you can go back to the text and read those. So I wanted to start out with just, some basic terminology. And so a really, really, really good book is the one written by His Holiness the Dalai Lama and Venerable Thupten Chodron, which is titled Realizing the Profound View. And so this is the book, in addition to Geshe Sopa's book, his commentary on the Lamrim, this particular chapter. Those 2 books are, and in addition to my notes from Geshe Darge's presentation, those are the main sources that I used to prepare this presentation. So His Holiness, in his book on page 20, he starts out with trying to clarify the terminology. So we talk a lot about, in this section, the key concepts is this idea of what's the difference between something being one, right? One and the same versus different, right? And, and at the same time, what's the difference between that idea of things being one and different versus one nature and a different nature? So he's talking about the ways in which things can be related. So I'm just going to pick out one point, which I thought was interesting, was when he talks about this very important point that there are two ways that objects can be related. And so I put that up on the slide. I think further down. Yeah, I put a lot of this on the slide. So, like you can go back and read this because it's a lot of information. So the first is that cause and effect, right? When we think of the relationship of cause and effect, what does that mean? So that implies that they're two things, right? Cause and effect. Yeah, they can't be the same thing, right? So it's a seed and a sprout. So two things can't be present at the same time, right? So you have to have one that gives rise to the other. So that's why the example of the seed and the sprout is given so often, right? So you have the seed that has the potential to produce the sprout in the future. And so what this means is that in any cause and effect relationship, we would say that the cause precedes the effect. It sounds kind of obvious, but the other important aspect is that the cause, not only does the cause have to come before the effect, the cause has to cease for the effect to arise, right? So for the sprout to grow, then this unsprouted seed can't stick around, right? So it has to go away, it's be eliminated. So this is, one presentation of this idea of cause and effect, and some of the other schools have slightly different interpretations, but this is as far as we're going for right now. And then the second aspect, or the second way that objects can be related is this idea of things being, one nature. So when we talk about one nature, then what does that really mean? So here we're saying that two things that are one nature exist at the same time. So essentially they're, identical, right? They both exist at the same time. And this is really important, this idea that one cannot exist without the other, right? So they're inseparable in the sense that you can't have one thing without the other thing. They're essentially identical, right? And so we're going to go through that with the example of the chariot, and it'll be a little bit clearer. But for now, I think this is a good thing to keep in mind when we talk about things being one nature versus different natures, right? So the main topic that we're trying to get at then through this these different kinds of analyses are this relationship or the meaning of something that exists inherently, right? And so the example that we're presented with in chapter 22 then is the chariot. So the question is, if the chariot existed inherently, hang on one second. How would we how would it exist? And so the sevenfold analysis that we're going to be diving into is just one of the different ways in which this topic is examined, right? And so the other ones, just to kind of rattle them off to jog your memory, and so that you can go back and read them, study them further. Although we didn't go into a whole lot of detail with Geshe Darge because we didn't have enough time. But there, he talked about neither one nor many as being one of the types of analyses. Then there's the fourfold analysis of emptiness and the fivefold analysis. Okay, and he went through each of those possibilities and said that the sevenfold analysis, which we'll look at right now, is based on the fivefold analysis. It just adds the last two. Collection of parts and the shape of the parts. So the sevenfold analysis explains that the chariot is neither other than its parts nor is it not other than its parts. It does not possess its parts, does not depend on the parts. The parts do not depend on it. It is neither the mere collection of the parts, and it's not the shape of the parts. So that is just a slightly different, verbiage for what's on the slide. I think what's on the slide is actually easier to understand. So we'll use that. What I just read was right out of the Lamrim Chemo. So if you were looking for the exact language, that's on page 279 in volume 3. And so Geshe Darge made the point of making sure that we understand the two key components that are important to keep in mind as we do this analysis of emptiness. So again, he repeated the importance of understanding the object of negation, right? Correctly identifying the object of negation. And then also, along with that, understanding the way logic is carried out, the way this idea of the logic of pervasion, this idea that if there are, two clearly established alternatives, then there's no room for a third alternative to exist, and being able to be satisfied with that a logical conclusion. Okay, so probably we shouldn't go into that anymore, but like we were talking about, and as we'll see this in the 7-point analysis, this idea of things being one or many, right? So there's nothing in between the one or the many, those two categories, right? So that's a logical pervasion. That kind of logic is something that we need to be comfortable with. So anyway, okay. So here we are, how to determine that there is no self in the person. Geshe-la read the quote on page 278 in the text, which says, self is a demonic mind. You have a wrong view. I don't think this is on the slides. These composite aggregates are empty. There is no living being in them. Just as one speaks of a chariot in dependence upon collections of parts, so we use the convention living being in dependence upon the aggregates. So that's like the overall quote to keep in mind as at the beginning of this discussion, right? So we're looking at the first point, which is showing that the chariot exists imputedly without intrinsic existence. So that's a really big statement. And when we use the term imputedly, maybe that's worth taking a little closer look at, just kind of refresh our memories. So imputedly means that something is, and we've heard this over and over again, merely labeled on the basis of the object of designation. So what does that really mean? So merely labeled, as Geshe-la explained, means that things exist. How do they exist? Because they're designated by language and thought. So language meaning, like words, linguistic convention, and thought meaning the meaning that we assign to that particular sound, which we call a word, right? So we refer to objects, such as flowers with the word in English would be flower, right? In Tibetan it would be meto, so it'd be a different sound, different sounds to refer to, the same thing, to refer to the same meaning, right? So you've got two things. You got the word, the label, and then the designated object would be, what are you referring to? What meaning are you carrying, conveying, right? So our words have a conventionally, agreed upon meaning, right? So that's the idea of something being imputed. Okay. So for the Prasangikas, then this gets tricky because they would say that things are only imputed, right? They lack any substantial existence. They're only there's nothing that exists within the object, itself. Everything only exists through this process of designation. That's what they only exist imputedly. Okay. For the lower tenet schools, then that's not the case. There is something substantially existent that could be pointed to, within a phenomena that gives it some kind of essence, some kind of ability to be differentiated from the next guy, from something else. Okay. Okay. So then going back to the 7-point analysis, and I don't think I put this on the chart on the slides, but I was going to just review or repeat Chandrakirti's famous verse. So a chariot is neither asserted to be other than its parts, nor to be non-other. It does not possess them. It does not depend on the parts, and the parts did not depend on it. It is neither the mere collection of parts, nor is it the shape. Okay. So that's the quote that I just broke down into the outline of the questions that we just read through. So it's good to it's actually probably really good to just memorize the quote, because if we remember that statement, that would have that's the whole 7-point analysis. It's easier to remember. So the 7-point analysis, the point of it is to prove that the chariot, how does the chariot exist? It exists as a mere imputation, right? Because it doesn't exist in any one of these 7 ways. It doesn't truly exist in any of these 7 ways. If it did truly exist in one of these 7 ways, if it had some kind of essential or intrinsic nature that identified it, then we would say that it is established by ultimate analysis. It is found through ultimate analysis. Okay. So what is the relationship between the chariot and its parts? We're still kind of at the high level, and then we're going to dig down into the details here. But what's the relationship between the chariot and its parts? So what's the designated object? In this case, designated object is not a trick question. It's the chariot, right? We're talking about the chariot being the designated object, and we're examining the relationship between the designated object and the basis of designation, right? Basis of designation being the collection of the parts. Okay. So that's what we're looking at, the relationship between, any any designated object, like the chariot, like the water bottle, right? And the basis of the designation, right? So it's not just, the word chariot, the word and the meaning chariot. It refers to something, right? It refers to, this collection of parts that we then say is a chariot. Okay. So it's that relationship that's really key. Okay. And then through that, like I said, through this, we're trying to figure out if the chariot did truly exist, well, then what does that really mean? Right. So we're going to go through this. So the first point was, would the chariot and the parts be the same entity? Okay. So that means if the chariot is inherently one with the parts, would the chariot and the parts then be exactly the same entity? Yeah, that's right. So if a truly existent chariot were one and the same as the parts, right, then that means that each part would be the same as the chariot. They would have to be, like exactly the same, right? We talked about that earlier, this idea of things being the same. So if that's the case, like this is hard to imagine, hard to think about, but then what we're saying is that the chariot would be, like there would be a single thing, the chariot or the car or the cup, right? But at the same time, just because the chariot is the same then the parts would have to have that same relationship. Would also have to be their own single things. Okay. So there would be this I was going to say collusion, like the collection of the parts and the chariot would just be identical, right? There would be no difference. That's what we're saying here. If the chariot were one and the same in the parts, then each part would be the same thing as the chariot. Okay. So you couldn't identify, what it comes down to is you couldn't identify the chariot separately from the axle, the baseboard, the wheels, right? Because there's a sense that the chariot would be identical to the parts. You couldn't tease them apart. And so a quality that is a characteristic of one aspect, one part, would apply to all of the others because it's all one and the same, right? So as Holiness was saying, like if the bottom, he uses the example of car. So he said, like, if the engine of the car was green, right, then everything else associated with this car, everything would be green because they're one and the same. So I thought that was a really good way of thinking about it. So furthermore, a truly existent chariot, right? So if the chariot is truly existent, right, then that means by definition, if it's truly existent, then something is going to be permanent. And what does that mean? It just means that it can't change. So something that's permanent can't change because it's not dependent on causes and effects. It can't change. It's permanent. And so it doesn't depend on anything either, right? It doesn't depend on anything, including the parts, because it can't depend on anything by definition, right? It's truly existent. And so if it can't depend on anything, including the parts, well, then if you take it a step further, then that means that the chariot can't be dissected or broken into, disassembled into the parts, right? Because it's one and the same, that it's all like whooshed together. So the arguments that we looked at, the three problems with this, of course they're problems because like it doesn't make any sense, right? So the three fallacies, yep, you got that. Yep, you're right. Okay, that's perfect. Yep, you got it. Each part individually. Yep, that's right. So each part individually would have to be the same chariot, right? That's what we're saying, because they're one and the same. So if each part individually is a chariot, then there would have to be, many chariots. So if there are 100 parts to the chariot, then that would be saying that there are like 100 different little chariots. They're all chariots because they're all the same. So each part would also be truly existent, because everything would be truly existent, not just a chariot, right? The parts themselves would be truly existent, meaning that they also wouldn't depend on anything. Okay. So everything would have to also would be a chariot. Okay. So that's the first point. And the second one, the other way to think about it would be, okay, if there's only one chariot, then if it's one and the same with the parts, then there's, only one part. That makes sense too. By that same logic, if there's only one chariot, then there's only one part. The one before that was that, you could say, well, no, there would have to be many, there's one chariot with many parts. Then if each part is the same as a chariot, then there would have to be many chariots. Okay, so two different ways of looking at it. And then the third part, which is interesting, is this idea that the idea of an agent and an object, which in this context seems to be that the agent is the part possessor, and the object that's being, so the part possessor in this case would be this idea of the chariot. What does the chariot, possess? Is the parts. Okay. So if the chariot exists inherently, then along the same lines, then there would be no difference between the chariot being the part possessor and the parts, right? They would have to be, if they're exactly the same, then you can't have that relationship between parts and parts possessor. So there could be no agent and no object. Ooh, that's a big statement. Big statement. Okay. So Geshe-la went through these that point in a lot of detail, and same with the second point. The first 2 points are really the most important. So they kind of everything else, the points, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 are all sort of variations or elaborations on these first two. So that's why it's worth spending more time on the first two, and then we'll go through the others much faster. So what if the chariot and the parts, existed separately? Okay, so if they're different entities, then how would that work out? Like, so would the chariot be able to exist separately? Well, exist inherently, but separate from the parts. Like, could you find the chariot separate from the parts? So if the chariot and its parts were inherently different, then they would have to exist from their own side. Okay, so again, there's a sense that if they're completely separate, then there's no relationship between them, no connection at all. And so you'd be able to see, the chariot over here and the parts over there. And if the chariot exists independent of the parts, then this is a really important point, is that, we were just talking about the relationship between the basis and the basis of designation, right? And we said that the chariot is considered the basis. And what is it based on? What's the basis of designation then? Is the parts, right? But if the chariot exists independent of the parts, then logically, there could be no basis for the chariot, because we just said that the basis of designation of the parts, is separate from the chariot. So we're like breaking that connection. Okay, so there would be nothing if there's no relationship between the chariot and its parts. Then what's the chariot imputed on, right? That there wouldn't be that connection. So the punchline is that to remember that we use language and thought, right? We just talked about that. We use language and thought in order to identify something on its basis. So that's in the Prasangika viewpoint, then that's the most important relationship, right? So how do we identify something? Well, it's through this use of language and thought to impute a basis, a label on the basis, on the parts. Okay. So His Holiness, he writes on page 24, and this is also an important point, but it's very subtle, I think, was for me. So he says, because he's talking about the difference between this ultimate analysis, looking to find this inherently existing, object, this inherently existing chariot in this example, right? But then how do we walk that back and think of, the conventional perspective? So he says that, we can say that conventionally, this is a quote, conventionally, the parts and the car, uses the car, are different, right? Conventionally, we can refer to the car and its parts as being different. But they're not different natures, okay? So this is interesting. So they're different because the car isn't the parts. They're different because the car isn't the parts, right? But they're not different natures. What does that mean? They're not different natures because they can't exist without each other. So they're not different natures because they can't exist without each other. So then we think, oh, what did that mean? If something can't exist without something else, right, then that means that it's one nature. So he's saying like conventionally, so if I reread this and put this last sentence first, conventionally the parts and the car are different, right? Because we can say that the car isn't identical to the parts. The car has parts or possesses parts. Car isn't exactly the same as the parts. Are they? I don't know. But he's saying conventionally the parts and the car are different, but they are one nature, right? And they're one nature in the sense that you can't have a car without the parts, right? The car has to, this idea of a car, the basis of the word, the label car is based on this collection of parts. So in that sense, they're one nature. Okay. All right. So that's worth going back and thinking about over and over again. All right. So then the next 2 points, 3 and 4, also, like I said before, they're going to boil down to the same analysis of things being inherently one or inherently different. So point 3 is, would the chariot be found within its parts? Yep. Like a person sitting in a tent? And then 4 was, would the chariot be the support for its parts? Like a container supports the yogurt inside it. So these are, closely related. They're sort of different variations on the same idea. Thank goodness. So the first one can also be stated as, is the chariot inherently the basis for its parts? So when we say, could it be found within the parts, then they're saying, is the chariot inherently the basis of its parts? And then the second point, would the chariot be the support for its parts? That's like saying, is the chariot inherently dependent on its parts? So if the chariot exists inherently, then neither of these these 2 options would hold true. So it can neither inherently serve as the basis for something else, such as the parts, right? Nor can it inherently depend on something else. And why is that? That's because something that exists inherently does not depend on anything, right? So an inherently existing chariot cannot be identified on the basis of the parts, right? That's what we just said. It can't be imputed on anything. So like we said, the relationship of dependence would not exist between the chariot and its parts. That's what we're really, and that's really important. This idea of like what we're trying to do is identify the relationship between, right, the chariot and its parts. And we're, in this case, in this point, right, points 3 and 4, we're looking at this idea of dependency. So if something is inherently existing, it can't depend on causes and conditions. And so if that's the case, then that there would be no relationship of dependence between the chariot and its parts. Woo. Oh boy, my poor dog. She's really scared of thunder. So both the basis and that which is dependent on it would be different entities. So, so the examples given are the pot holding yogurt and Devadatta in a tent. So, so it inherently, just to go through those very, very briefly, the idea of the pot holding yogurt, I thought these were kind of hard to understand, to be honest, the pot holding yogurt. An inherently existent chariot. Right, we talked about this idea of the chariot being the basis, yeah? Would support, what does it support? The parts, right? So an inherently existent chariot, meaning the basis, would support the parts, that being, the dependent, that which is dependent, right? What's the basis supporting? that which is dependent, in this case, parts, just like a pot being the basis, holds that which is dependent, meaning the yogurt. Okay. It's almost like giving another example to explain the example of the chariot and the parts, right? And then the second one is if the chariot is inherently dependent on the parts, right? It's inherently dependent on the parts, then it would have to be found in the parts, just like Devadatta. Devadatta being the dependent is found sitting in a tent, the tent being the basis. So, kind of something to think about, scratch your head over. So the bottom line, though, is that points 3 and 4, the ones that we just covered, prove that things are not inherently existent, because if they were, then they would be unrelated, and this would refute this idea of the inherent existence of a basis, right? And that which depends on it. So this is just one more way of eradicating this idea of inherent existence. Okay, because this type of relationship between the basis and the object of designation would not be possible. Okay, so 746 might actually make it to the end of this. Okay, so then the fifth point is that would the chariot possess its various parts inherently? So another way in which things, can be related is this idea of possession. So there are two cases. If two things are inherently different, then they are inherently separate. They're unrelated entities. The same way, I like this example better. I mean, I understood this point, I think, a little better than the other one. I got stuck with trying to imagine Devadatta in the tent. I was like, I don't know why. But here we're talking about if things are inherently different, then they're inherently separate, unrelated entities, the way that Devadatta possesses cows. It's like, that's kind of easy to remember. Like, Devadatta is this person, he's over here. What does he possess? This idea of possession, of owning things, of having things. Well, you kind of think that, okay, like the cow. There's no relationship between Devadatta and the cow. The cow is an independent. It exists. It's easy to think of the cow being separate from Devadatta, right? But here we're talking about things being inherently separate, right? Inherently separate. So meaning that the parts could be in one place and the chariot could be somewhere else, right? So like, right. So like we talked about that before under the discussion of things being inherently different. Okay, so just another tweak, thinking of things are inherently different. That means they're inherently separate. So this idea of possession needs to be examined from the same perspective. Okay, so then the other one would be if the things are inherently the same, then what does that mean? So again, if things are inherently the same, then they're inherently inseparable. So what would that look like in terms of possession? Well, if things are inherently inseparable, then they would be the same entity. And so the example that's given is I think it's kind of funny. It's the way that Devadatta possesses, his ears, right? You can't have these ears without Devadatta's head, without Devadatta as a person, right? They're one and the same. One can't exist without the other, okay? Like you can't have a random ear like just out there, right? No, it's going to be one and the same with this inherently inseparable from Devadatta. All right. Okay. Okay, so if we can get through all of those points 1 through 5, and we've got a pretty good understanding of how those work together, then 6 and 7 are a breeze, right? 6 and 7 are kind of go together, as a pair. So point 6 is, would the chariot be the mere collection of the parts? And 7 would be, would the chariot be more than just a random heap of its parts? Instead, there's some kind of special arrangement, special configuration of the parts. So, when the things are assembled in just the right way, then you can apply, this label of a chariot. Right? Then there would be like this inherently existing chariot. So point 6 says that if the mere collection of the parts is a chariot, then we would be able to find the chariot even when it's just like this big pile of parts, right? And point 7 says no, if there is no chariot as a whole, this is a really good point, actually. Point 7 says if there's no chariot, there's no idea of a chariot as a whole, right? If there is no chariot as a whole, then how can you have, the parts of a chariot? Right? Can't have the chariot. If there's no chariot as a whole, then you also, there's no way that you can say, well, these are the parts of a chariot if there's no chariot for the parts to be part of. Okay. And then taking it a step further, right? Then the shape, like, so the objection that's, raised to that argument, like the opponent comes back and says, well, okay, I didn't say that. I said it's the shape. It's the shape, the arrangement of the parts. That's the inherently existing chariot. Okay, so the assertion that the chariot is a mere collection of the parts has 2 flaws. So maybe I didn't put it on the slide. I ran out of time. So I'm sorry. But I'll just do this. I'm going to do the short version of this. The first is the first problem is that it's contrary to reason for the collection of the parts to be the chariot. So if we take apart the chariot and randomly, we talked about this in class quite a bit, right? If we take apart the chariot and there's just this random pile of stuff, and say, then this would be, this is the collection of all the parts that were associated with the chariot. But if the chariot, this inherently existing chariot, were able, if we could identify this inherently existent chariot on the basis of the collection of the parts, right? Then even when the parts are in the big pile, right, when there is no particular shape, the chariot has been completely pulled apart, we would still be able to find this inherently existing chariot. Okay. But we know that, even conventionally, that's not the case, right? If you came upon a random pile of stuff, and you didn't know from prior experience or from somebody telling you that this random pile of stuff was actually a car, there's no way, even conventionally, you wouldn't know that it's a car, right? You just see it as a pile of stuff. Like, it could be a motorcycle. Maybe it's the parts of, some other type of transportation, right? I mean, you can kind of guess, but again, that's based on your prior understanding, your prior knowledge, your prior understanding of words and concepts, right? Okay, and then the second reason why the assertion that the chariot is the mere collection of the parts is a problem is that it contradicts the way that the lower tenet schools, in particular the Buddhist realists or essentialists, who accept true existence. Okay, so this is interesting. For them, I think this is, I wanted to look into this a little bit more. The collection of parts exists, but the whole does not exist. right? So they would say that the collection of parts piled in a heap exists, and yet the chariot itself does not exist. So for them, there are no wholes, wholes. But the collection or the group of parts is imputed, okay? So there is the collection or the group is imputed. They don't exist substantially, okay? They're only imputed. But the chariot and the parts themselves are substantially existent. So that's really strange. So on the one hand, the chariot and the parts are substantially existent, and yet at the same time, if you take the collection of parts, those are merely imputed. And that's really hard. So for them, there are no wholes. Okay, the collection of parts exists, but the chariot as a whole does not exist. So anyway, the Prasangikas reject this, thank goodness. The Prasangikas reject this because if the whole doesn't exist, then neither would the parts nor would the collection, right? So the parts depend on the whole. I mean, that's the way we normally think of things, right? Chandrakirti says a chariot can be refuted as being the mere collection of the parts, even conventionally, though. And this gets a little more nuanced. So since the collection of the parts is the basis of imputation of the chariot, right? That's what we've been talking about. Then it can't be the chariot itself. So the basis of imputation, or the basis of designation, if you want to use the same terminology that we've been using before. I don't want to throw in a new term. I didn't mean to do that. The basis of designation cannot be the same as the object itself. Okay. So the word watch, I think this is the example that Geshe Darge gave. The word watch is labeled on a collection of parts. But even conventionally, the collection of the parts is not the watch, because it is the basis of imputation of the watch. The parts are not the watch. The collection can be labeled watch, right? So the collection of the parts, that's what we label as watch, not the parts themselves, I guess. So it all comes down to the same point that we've been making over and over again, which is that the label or the basis, watch in this case, is labeled on the basis of designation. And how does that happen? This happens through conceptual and linguistic convention. Okay. So there's a lot to go back and think about here. Is the car the shape or the arrangement of its parts? Right. So this is that final point that we're trying to pick up here. So if an inherently existent car were the shape of its parts, then there would be two alternatives. So either the shape of the individual parts before they are assembled would be the car, or the arrangement of the collection of parts after they are assembled would be the car. So this boils down to that same way of analyzing things as being either inherently one or inherently different. So if things exist as being inherently one, then we would say that the car, the chariot, would be the shape of all of the individual parts. So, the wheels, the nuts, the bolts, those individual shapes. would have to be somehow identical to the shape of this car as a whole. So there's no way that would work out, because if something's inherently one, then it's that idea of things being virtually inseparably the same, identical. So that wouldn't happen. It doesn't make sense. If things are inherently different, then His Holiness explains this point on page 27 in his book. He says, again, relating it back to conventional understanding. He says, conventionally, we can say that when the parts are put together, a new shape is seen. But again, if the shape of the parts, existed inherently, then a new shape could not arise when the parts are assembled, because inherently existing things can't change. They're not influenced by causes and conditions. So always going back to this idea of how things exist inherently versus how things are thought to be are understood to exist, conventionally. So just a little recap or summary. So we talked about how the essentialists, the lower tenet schools, assert, what do they assert? They assert true existence. And so what does that mean for them? For them, a chariot exists without being designated by word and thought. And so if a truly existent chariot cannot be found through, what we're calling ultimate analysis, right? Ultimate analysis meaning this search for an inherently existing or truly existing object, right? Such as through the 7-point analysis, then that means that the chariot doesn't exist either ultimately or conventionally. Okay. So that's a really important point. So when reasoning searches to see whether a chariot has this, intrinsic nature, whether it exists inherently, and when it can't find, that chariot, then the conclusion that these essentialists have to and end up with is that the chariot does not exist. Okay? Chariot just doesn't exist. So it's kind of like a dead end, an analytical dead end in a sense, right? And so thank goodness for the Prasangikas, because for the Prasangikas, it's a truly existent chariot, that we were looking for through the 7-point analysis and all the other types of analysis. Through that kind of ultimate analysis, right? So the truly existent chariot, we just, exhaustively determined that it doesn't exist, right? That it can't be found in any of those 7 ways, right? But for the Prasangikas, the conventionally existing chariot does exist, right? Thank goodness, the conventionally existent chariot does exist. And why is that? Because it is posited through worldly convention, right? It's posited through worldly convention, meaning through, language and thought. It always comes back to language and thought. Things existing imputedly, right? How do things exist imputedly? Through reliance on, dependence on this process of labeling that occurs through assigning, words, linguistic conventions to a basis designation. Okay, so chapter 22 is really exciting, really fascinating. And, we use it as the springboard to then look at, like the big finale, the moment we've all been waiting for is how do you apply the 7-point analysis to the self, right? To the person. So it's the person lacks intrinsic nature, right? Wow, it all comes back. Finally, we're talking about me, me, myself, and I. That's what I've been waiting for. Tell me how I exist. So the 7-point analysis is used to examine the relationship between the person, right, the sense of self, and the aggregates, right, the 5 aggregates. Right? And why is this, of such great personal import? Why do I care so much about this? Well, because, and it's always good to remember why we're studying this, why we're working hard to try to understand these concepts is because we apply it to our daily lives, right? And so, why are we so miserable? Okay, I'll just say, why am I so miserable? Shouldn't say that anybody else is. Why am I so miserable? Well, that's because I grasp at this, mistaken appearance of like this truly existing I, right? This truly existing me, myself, and I. And because of that, due to my self-grasping ignorance, then I cause myself, all kinds of problems and all, endless misery and suffering because of this deluded sense of self, because of this ignorant, perspective on reality, right? Because of that, it causes all kinds of suffering. And not only is it suffering in this life, but, we're cycling through samsara over and over again. We're on that roller coaster because of this self-grasping ignorance. Okay. So if we could finally, for once and for all, if we could recognize that the person lacks intrinsic nature, then we're good. Okay. So His Holiness, points out that the conventionally existent person is dependent on his or her aggregates. Again, going back to conventional reality, conventionally existent person is dependent on the aggregates, right? So again, this idea of dependency, very, very important. We were just talking about that through the 7-point analysis, right? So we said the conventionally existent person is dependent on the aggregates, yet an inherently existent person cannot be. And why is that? Because an inherently existent person is independent of causes and conditions, right? That was one of the key statements, key points. So again, when the 7-point analysis fails to find that the person exists, inherently in that specific way, the person cannot be found to exist inherently, or the chariot or whatever, right? Then this disproves or refutes the inherent existence, of the person, right? But it doesn't affect, it doesn't uproot or eradicate, it doesn't touch or negate the conventionally existent person. So it's worth, just repeating that like over and over again. I think that's kind of like the bottom line, right? Really, really important point. Easy to get tripped up on, easy to go, to the extreme of nihilism. Okay, so just this, I can't go into, unfortunately, Geshe-la went a little further than I'm going to go through in tonight's session. So just again, this is like the high level overview, and you can go back and reread. So the first point was, is the person one and the same as the aggregates? So what would be the problem if the person were one and the same as aggregates? Well, okay, the first problem is that asserting a self would be redundant, right? So again, that idea of things being inseparably one nature, inseparable. So if the self were one with the aggregates, again, it would have to be exactly the same in name and meaning. So that means that there would be no need to even talk about, like you wouldn't even need the words mind and body, right? Because they would all mean the same thing. There would only be, not only just mean the same thing, they would be essentially identical, right? Essentially equivalent, right? So mind and body and I, right? They're all inseparably one. There's no way to differentiate them. Okay. So asserting the sense of a self would be redundant. Like you couldn't even really do it, could you? Because it would just be one and the same, right? Mind, body, all this like mushed together with this idea of a self. You couldn't differentiate them. The second problem would be that the person would be many, or the aggregates would be one. So again, that same logic that we've been talking about. So if there's, we say that the self is based on the 5 aggregates, right? If the self is based on the 5 aggregates, then if the self is truly inherently existing and is based on the 5 aggregates, then there would have to be 5 selves. Or conversely, the other way of looking at the same issue is if there's only one self, there's an inherently existing one self, one nature, then again, there could only be one aggregate, like one big aggregate, I guess. Okay. So I'm just really condensing these down. And you can go back and take a closer look at the text. But agent and action would have to be one. Again, that's the same as the third point from the 7-point analysis that we looked at for the chariot. Agent and action would be one. So in the case of applying this to the person, that the person would be inherently one with the aggregates, and there would be no difference. So that means that you couldn't say that there's an agent, right? There's an object possessor, like the self, right? And then there would be no object, no body, no basis to appropriate, right? Because they would have to be one and the same. Couldn't make a differentiation between a parts possessor and parts. Okay, no agent and no object to appropriate. And then the fourth point is that the person would inherently arise and disintegrate. And there's a little quote from the Gardner that says, if the aggregates were the self, then the self would arise and cease. And so we could insert inherently. So to make this a little clearer, right? So if the aggregates were the self, then the self would inherently have to arise and cease. So we know that this is really interesting. I think this whole idea of how things arise and abide and disintegrate, this is a very, very interesting and nuanced subject. It's a really big topic. So it would be good to go back and read this, specific topic from different perspectives, from different angles, from different commentators. But anyway, all we're going to say here is that we know, conventionally that we're born, that we change, over time, and that we die. But the problem is if the self is inherently one with the aggregates, right? Going back to the inherently existing, it's inherently one with the aggregates, then, like we said before, it would not depend on causes and conditions. And as such, it would be permanent and couldn't change from moment to moment. So what that means is, and this is a quote from His Holiness, once one moment of that person ceased, then the person would be permanently gone. And then the next moment of the person would arise without a cause. So again, that sense of disconnect, right? So there would be no continuity, no relationship between the moments of the continuum of a self, right? So we think of the self as being this like a chain, like a continuum of moments, of individual moments, right? That's what I'm trying to convey when I say continuum. Like, so it's the moments that follow each other successively and that we label as a self or a mind stream, right? So if the self existed inherently, then I'm just repeating this, then it would be permanent. It wouldn't be able to change. So there could be no continuity because there would be no relationship between these moments, right? It'd be like individual separate moments, not adding up. So there would be no connection between ourselves, right? Or ourselves referring to, our bodies, our minds, like when we were children, and when and our current, existence, right? Our current form, let's say, our current bodies, our current and mind, okay? Because if we're saying that there's this disconnect, right? Then there would be no way to look back in time and say, oh, this is there's a relationship between who I am now, right now, and who I was, even 10 minutes ago or 15 minutes ago, let alone going back to when I was, uh, when I was that cute little baby that I have a picture of in my family photo album, right? There's me, like smiling and looking cute. Nope, there would be no relationship if I was, the person is inherently existing, inherently one with the aggregates, right? So specifically, that's sort of like the general, hey, you got a problem. And then specifically, there are three fallacies that if the I is unrelated to the preceding and subsequent moments, right? So if the I, inherently existing I, is unrelated to the preceding and subsequent moments, which is just what we were just talking about, okay? And this is the end of the talk. I'm just going to list the 3 points. Recalling previous lives would be impossible. And Geshe-la did talk about that. The second point was the actions that we did would not bring results. And the third is that we could experience results of actions that we did not do. So that's going to be really interesting. We can kind of dive into a closer look at karma, I guess, and how this relates to that. So when we pick up with Geshe-la, guess, coming Tuesday in the next class, then I think he's going to maybe finish up. I think he finished it. He's going to talk about the actions that we did would not bring results. So that should be really interesting. So in conclusion, we're kind of going full circle. In conclusion, what have we been looking at? What are we trying to understand? Again, it all comes back to trying to really recognize, making sure we have a clear understanding of this object of negation. What are we really looking at through this analysis, right? And when we look at how, ignorance, right? This ignorance is this habit that we have had since the beginning of this time that superimposes, that adds something. What does it add? It superimposes this, false way of understanding, how things exist. Right? It's falsely projects this sense of for the lower schools. It falsely projects this idea of a self-sufficient, substantially existing. It's a substantial existence, right? It adds that to the sense of a self, to the sense of phenomena, to objects, right? From the Prasangika perspective, then the ignorance, plasters everything with this false view of inherent existence, right? That's what we've been talking about through these different types of analyses, ultimate analyses, in particular the 7-point analysis, right? And so what's the problem is that due to our self-grasping ignorance, we're just like blindfolded. We're wearing those dark glasses, right? We're totally duped, totally deceived by ignorance, right? We're totally tricked by how things, appear to exist, right? They appear to exist truly from their own side, to have some kind of identifiable characteristic or essence that helps us identify, distinguish one thing from the next. Feel that there's something there that distinguishes, like, the color green from the color aquamarine, a different color, like, even something kind of subtle. There's some essence to that color that you've got to be able to point to. And yet, from the Prasangika perspective, no, it all is just everything exists imputed by, language and thought. Other than that, we're good. There's nothing there. Okay. So ignorance makes it difficult to identify the object of negation, which is the inherently existing I, or inherently existing self. And what is that? It's the conceived object of this self-grasping, of a sense of self. So I would say that really good to go back to the top. Like, it brings us full circle. You go back to the outline that we started with at the beginning of this presentation, and wow, just go through and see, if anything is a little bit unclear, seems a little fuzzy, then exactly where to go back. Identifying, the object of negation, chapters 10 to 17, right? The actual determination of reality, chapters 10 to 24. We're still in the heart of, this analysis, and it's always good to go back and make sure the foundation is really firm, so that we can ask good questions in class and move forward as the topic gets, more and more difficult, more and more subtle, right? Because chapter 24, objects lack intrinsic existence, right? When we start to apply the same way of thinking to the context, in the context of how phenomena exist, right? We talked about how the person lacks intrinsic nature, and then the next topic is going to be how do phenomena lack intrinsic nature, right? Really, really interesting to see, to look at this, and so important to have these core topics, core subjects under our belt. So I would encourage you to go back to the handout that Gisela gave us on, I think it was April 8th, like the first class in the series. He gave us this very, very helpful PDF handout called The Essential Points. And it does like a brief summary of the different ways in which the tenet schools, present or talk about this topic of emptiness. So I think that would be really helpful to just. It's a really nicely and very succinct. It's only like 2 pages, but everything is there. And so that's it. That's a good way to go back and prepare for his next teachings on this topic. Okay. So, wow, unbelievable. It's 8:30. Yay. So I think we're going to end there. I'm going to run home and let my dog comfort my dog because it's a thunderstorm. And if you're interested in the slides, from this presentation, I don't know if they're very helpful, but you can feel free to email me or whatever, tendrol108@gmail.com. If you have any questions, ask Yoshidarge. Don't ask me. Guess that's it.
Anila, thank you. And if it's any reassurance, I'm in Bethel and we have not had any thunder yet.
Oh, good.
Really? You can't hear it over there?
I drive really fast.
You're very instant.
We live in a different part from each other, but just a little hope. And thank you so much for the review.
Oh, you're welcome.
Thank you, Ani.
Anila.
You're welcome. Tomato Tron, rerubbing Genie, Megan Buddy, Wolverine. Trokunam Najin Parsho, Gidam, Guru Ratna Mandala Kamlayatayami. Rinpoche, Marge Panam, Gegurti, Keparnyam Paramipayam, Gongne Gongdu Pelwarsho. Croatian come dear, Kandan Dewa Malu Chongwene, Tenrizi Wantenzing Yatsui, Shape Site Bardu Tangyurti. Boy, my eyesight's really bad. I said my eyesight's really bad. I can't even flip the screen is right there. Sorry about that. I'm sorry. I can't see. Is there another one?
Yeah. You see it, right?
No, I can't. I think I really have low vision. Wait, can you read it? You can read it. Because the version I have doesn't even have these prayers. I have an old version of the prayers. And it's not even in it.
I mean, the soul innocent and the spell of all the innocent, the grasp the extremes, and the nation of the creation. The indication of spirit and ability in the solution successfully, ability just worship and follows from the compliment of the children of belief. This virtue that all beings, different people, the nation, wisdom, and achieve for the body, otherwise for the wisdom.
Thank you, Venerable Tribala, for all your help.
Good night.
Good night. Thank you.